Yeah.
Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us on this beautiful early morning. It feels so wonderful to be out in this gorgeous city on this gorgeous day, so thank you for joining us.
Maybe I'll say a few words on
Please.
behalf of the Galien Forum. I'm Mike Rosenblatt, and I'm co-chairing the forum with Sue Desmond-Hellman. And it's really wonderful to have everybody here in person in this wonderful venue, the Alexandra Center. We're very glad to be back. The attendance is very high, so you've all voted with your feet. And it looks like a really terrific program. Once again, we've gathered leaders from the biopharmaceutical industry, from regulatory agencies, from academia, and others who interface with the biopharmaceutical industry. And we're going to be doing our usual in terms of the types of sessions that we have. We've chosen to have panel discussions and talks on challenges, issues, and controversies in the industry. We're covering a number of broad topics, including pricing, diversity and equity, mental health, COVID, and others. We'll have our usual panel of a discussion with some CEOs of the industry, a fireside chat with the FDA Commissioner, Rob Califf, and a special presentation by Tony Fauci. So it should be a great day. We're very glad you're all here. And I'm going to turn it over to the first panel's moderator, Alex von PLATO.
Hi. Well, we have a nice softball topic to kick us off. No controversy here. And that is, are prescription drug prices too high? It turns out that Roy Vagelos, 30 years ago, wrote an article while he was the CEO and chairman of Merck that asked this question and posited that the pharmaceutical industry has a social contract with society to make sure that we're delivering the medical innovation in a way that is also accessible and affordable to provide the best benefit for the most people. And there are many, many forces in our industry and our economy and in the healthcare system that impact the ability to do that. And today, this esteemed panel is going to discuss some of those forces and their point of view on what those forces are and how perhaps the industry can begin to make some different kinds of impact on pricing. Michael already introduced himself, but I will also share that Dr. Michael Rosenblatt is a senior advisor at Flagship Pioneering and also at Bain Capital, and was the former chief medical officer for Merck. Dr. Stanley CROOKE, who is at the end of the row here, is the CEO and chairman of n-Lorem Foundation and the founder and former CFO of Ionis. He was also head of R&D at SmithKline Beecham. And Dr. Harold Paz, who we call Hal, is the CEO of Stony Brook Medicine and also was the former EVP of CVS Health Aetna. So we have a wide variety of expertise and points of view. I'm Alex von PLATO. I'm the CEO of Publicis Health, and I work in the area of health engagement, patient engagement, marketing communications in the pharmaceutical industry. So I just want to start with the first question, and that is, in this moment right now, this is all in the headlines. I mean, we're in a political season. It is the political football of the decade, actually, and we're at historic inflationary moment. So the cost of everything is preying on people's minds, and the cost of prescription drugs couldn't be more topical. Are prescription drug prices too high? What do you think, Michael?
I think some are too high. I think some are actually a bargain, if you think of it. Ones that have been on the market quite a while and continue to serve public health. The problem, and there's been some egregious behavior and some very good behavior. So I don't think there's a simple answer to it. But some of the complexity comes from trying to say, well, what do we mean by the price of a drug? The price of a drug, there's a list price on day one, which almost nobody pays. When competition comes in, it often falls dramatically. Sovaldi, there was great controversy about its price of $80,000. 18 months later, it was $40,000. And then, drugs eventually go generic. They become very cheap. People don't pay the same price for a drug, depending on your plan and on your geography. There are multiple contributors to the total cost of a drug, not just the pharmaceutical industry, but PBMs, insurers, and others. How much would be the right proportion to give to them? So for me, the question, I would modify the question and say, are people paying too much out of pocket? Because I think that's the pain point for people. And it is very clear that depending on your work situation and your insurance, you could either be in great shape in terms of access to medicines and not be bothered by it, or you could be on the brink of financial disaster for your family if you need a particular drug. So it's not a simple answer, probably that you wanted, Alex, but that's my view.
Well, obviously it's hugely complex, but are people paying too much out of pocket? I like your refinement of the question. I mean, Hal, what's your point of view from your unique background?
There was a recent study in the Annals of Internal Medicine that looked at patients with diabetes, and they found that 1.3 million Americans are rationing insulin. That's 16% of the population they surveyed. Undoubtedly, for a patient population with a chronic illness, it is having a direct and immediate impact. And I totally agree with Michael. It is absolutely complex. So yeah, I come from the background of payer and pharmacy, now on the provider side. And I, just full disclosure, served on the Corporate Bioscience Advisory Board of a very large pharma company and also a startup company. So I can see every side of the equation. And I think it's about the complexity. It's about the cost. Consumers understand that it's not just what they're paying retail. And by the way, 80% of all prescription drugs are generic. But 80% of the spend is on brand name drugs, specialty drugs. And as taxpayers, we pay 4 different ways. So we're paying for our investment in the NIH, which creates basic science research, which eventually becomes these dramatic breakthroughs which save lives, improve health and well-being. There are tax credits. There's what we all pay our insurers, either directly as through our employer or as through Medicare or Medicaid or other governmental programs. And then finally, after all that, what we pay when we show up at the pharmacy in terms of co-pays and deductibles. And that degree of complexity, I think, just adds layers to the frustration, to what we've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act that was just passed. And I think when my friend Roy wrote that paper 30 years ago, I think our spending on marketing was about $47 million. The last time I could find data on this, 2006, it was $5 billion. So as an industry, and let me just be very clear, direct-to-consumer advertising has its benefits in terms of patients who have an underlying illness being aware of there being options for them, to remind them to take their meds. There's evidence that it improves adherence, but there's also a lot of evidence that says it creates a lot of stress and strain and cost on the system. And as a member, I'm going to see patients tomorrow morning. As a member of the AMA has come out against direct-to-consumer advertising. It's amplified everything in the public awareness such that I believe that the public looks at this as the tip of the entire iceberg of the cost of health in this country. And that's the looming issue we all face, all of us, the cost of health care in this country. 20% of GDP and just continuing to go up and up and up.
So you're talking about a lot of things, but one of them is optics. You know, so the optics that are created from the investments in creating awareness, broad awareness of their innovations and medicines, you believe is part of why there's this over-indexing on and vilification of the industry as it relates to the cost of health care. Do you agree with that, Stan?
I do. I guess my answer to the basic question you asked would have to be yes and no. I think to the patient and the payer, it's a resounding yes. And it frankly doesn't matter whether they're justified to have that opinion. It's the perception that matters. And the thing that, and Hal touched on it, what I find most concerning is that in most of the developing economies, there's de facto rationing of drugs. In the U.S., it's made actively by the patient. Do I eat or do I pay my copay? But it's happening around the world, and that is the worst outcome I could imagine for all parties. And I think the adversarial approach that's being taken with the NICE and with CMS and everybody imposing their view of value is failing, and it will get worse. So that, to me, is a focus that everyone should have. How do we solve that? And to my mind, the problem is that there's only a single person, only one category of person who can judge the value of a drug. That's the patient or parent. And yet you've interposed all these other judgments. And I think you make then the problem binary. Do I eat or do I take my pill? When I think if we find a way to put that in that decision-making more in the consumer's choice category and make the choice less binary. I mean, I could imagine something like if you want to take this drug, then your copay for dental will go up. Or maybe you don't get the most plush end-of-life hospice. But I think the choice that's being made today is so binary, and it's made by the wrong people. And it's going to continue to be made by the wrong people. So yeah, I think there are a lot of problems, and they've been discussed already. And from the industry side, the answer is no. Nobody likes high prices, and nobody likes price increases every year. But we do it because we need to fill that profit gap. And that's driven by the inefficiency of drug discovery. And I think the practice that the industry is engaging in, which is in annual price increases in a lot of different places, is very difficult for people to accept any justification. I don't think there's a way to put enough lipstick on that to make it anything but a pig. And so, yeah, the problem is enormously complex. But I think at heart, there are two issues. One, the decision about value is in the wrong hands. And two, the inefficiency of drug discovery continues to be a major issue. And I said that publicly first in 1985. And then in 1989, I actually put my money where my mouth is, and I founded Ionis. And, you know, the technology we created is vastly more efficient. So I think the answer has to reside in enhancing the productivity in industry, get the middlemen out of this equation, and put more of the decision-making in the hands of the patient, which is where it belongs.
I would agree that patients should be able to make informed decisions based on their needs and their understanding. The issue that we confront is that they're not able to make an informed decision about the expense of their resources, of their money to their health care, because there is no transparency and they're not educated enough, and very few people are, to be able to navigate the system. And one of my hypotheses would be, and my team, we talk about really shifting some of the funds and investment in what's going into traditional DTC to patient engagement and helping people understand how to make more informed choices for themselves and to participate with more confidence in their health care. And this is an investment that needs to be made because people are not going to just get this from the internet. It's going to need to be delivered to them, and they're going to have to be brought along. But as we see consumerism come into healthcare, who is going to create the informed consumers, and what is the role of industry to do their part in that regard? So I offer that up to you as how do we take some of the investment we're making in the traditional marketing and apply it to actually, patient engagement and making patients more equipped.
Alex, I'm not fond of the consumer analogy. A consumer, in my view, is somebody who walks into a store and goes online and can make a decision about what they want to buy or decide to pass. That's very different than a patient. Patient has no choice. Patient has to take some therapy. Often there are limited options. And while I agree completely with you that education about the process and the value would be very helpful, the patient today, as does the doctor, has to operate. It means that we're accepting a system of the very convoluted insurance. In fact, and I'm going to be a little provocative here, I don't think in terms of drugs that we really have insurance in America. I think we have very complicated cost-sharing plans. And depending on the price of the drug, depending on so many variables, the patient winds up in a cost-sharing situation. And that cost-sharing is detached from good medicine. In what world would the donut in Medicare make sense from a medical viewpoint? So you're sick, you need medicine, you're paid. Then if you continue to be sick, you have to pay more out of pocket. And then if you continue after that to be sick, you're covered again. It doesn't make sense. And we have tiers of drugs, some of which you get very good reimbursement and some of which you get very poor. As far as I can tell, it's not related to the illness or the severity. So you're asking people to, so education would be great. You're asking people to be educated and informed about their illness and the value of the drug. But then it's all operating on top of a platform which I think probably nobody up here even understands fully.
Would you like to comment on that?
Wildly complex. You have not only manufacturers, you have wholesalers, you have PBMs, you have pharmacies, you have payers. I don't know if anyone saw Axios this morning. There was an article about Mark Cuban's Cost Plus. Right, some of you are shaking your head. So listen to this. 1.2 million members. It just started in January. 1,000 generics. The cost is the manufacturer cost, 15% markup, and a $3 handling fee for the pharmacist. So I'm going to use a brand name, excuse me for doing this, Gleevec. List price, if you were to buy it through, as a patient, $9,600. Through them, it's $47. As Mike said, layer upon layer upon layer of complexity. And that's just in the pharmacy space. In the pharmaceutical space, I can tell you from where I sit, it is across the entire landscape of healthcare in this country. It is unbelievable.
I think it's particularly sad that the two groups that really provide value, which are physicians and the pharmaceutical biotech industry, are the places that are being abused the most. In the meantime, you got all these other elements siphoning off dollars that are going to whom? administrators. And I think it's terrible. But I will say, I believe strongly that 25% of revenue in R&D is not enough. And we spend way too much money in marketing, and we spend it wrong. I actually feel that the REMS model is kind of the right model. It's spent in finding the right patient, getting the right patient on the drug, and keeping the right patient on the drug through a variety of processes. So, yes, I agree with everything that's said, but I also think that the industry is culpable. And we spend too much money, as Michael said, on TV ads, and too little on getting the right patient to the right drug in the right time in the right way. And until we fix that, I think we have to share some of the accountability for this mess.
And I think that's a totally actionable comment, though, which is a silver lining here, because shifting the focus of what has been traditionally marketing to patient engagement that supports patients' care and understanding, engages patients in their treatment, and enables them to have a better outcome as a result of the communications expenditure is something that could become a bigger priority and a bigger focus for what is now traditionally the marketing budget, which is focused on sales, not on patient support and patient services. And so how does the industry participate, more deliberately in what has been the provider space, helping a patient understand what their condition is, what their treatment is, how to understand and anticipate side effects, how to stay adherent, all of those touch points along the patient journey that can be extrapolated and patient can be engaged around. We've learned how to do that. I think as an industry, we're just now starting to put an investment focus on doing that better and better, more efficiently, more effectively, to the better outcomes for patients. We talked about R&D a little bit. We touched on the connection between pricing and the political pressure on the industry and whether or not it's chilling in any way the investment in pipelines and R&D or in certain therapeutic categories. Michael, do you have a point of view on that?
Well, I think the in this issue is highlighted in part by the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the sentiments about the industry is engendering the notion that there need to be price controls, at least for some drugs. Depending on your viewpoint, one step in that direction has been taken, and maybe that's it, or your viewpoint might be this is the beginning of a big change. I think, to me, price control would certainly have a chilling effect. The notion that you could make the R&D investments and not be able to recover them, I think is a potentially big problem. I also think that Medicare, while I am in favor of having Medicare negotiate prices, I actually don't know how you can do it when you have one entity that is holding all the cards, basically. So I don't know what kind of negotiation that could be. So I think that there is potentially a chilling effect, or else there's a distortion of the R&D effort, which is we're going to stay away from research in this area, even though there's a medical need, because the context that we're operating in says that might not work out for the company, and so we better focus on other things. So it's not only a potentially chilling effect, it's a distortion of where you put your efforts.
You bet.
Yeah, and again, I think lots of concerns. The perception is, and I think it was in 2008, the launch price of the new drug was about $2,000. In 2021, it was $180,000. That's perception. That's a 20% annual increase in launch price. Now, if you normalize that for the incredible impact that these new discoveries, particularly biologicals and a whole host of large molecule type drugs have had on saving lives, it's dramatic. And so you factor that in, it's about a 10% increase year after year, to be fair. So that's part of the perception piece of it. Jeffries just did an analysis looking at the Inflation Reduction Act, and they looked at the impact, I think it was by the year 2032. And in their analysis, they said the total impact on the industry is about $32 billion. $38 billion, I guess is the number. If you translate that into market cap, it's 3% of the entire market cap of the industry. I think, to your point, Mike, everyone should pay a lot of attention to this because one just doesn't know if this is the beginning of a process. This is the only country among all 34 OECD nations that does not have the government step in until recently, except for TRICARE and the VA and a couple of very small, differences, step in and regulate the cost of drugs. And I think it's really, we're at a point now, at an inflection point, where everyone needs to sit down and figure out how do we create that value proposition in ways that the public, that the patient, that the consumer, and that political leaders understand. If we're not careful with this experiment, we could find ourselves in a place where America's pharmaceutical industry, which is driving discovery around the world, is not able to do the incredible things it's done for the past 3 decades. And that's my big concern.
It seems certainly that's where we're heading, certainly in the court of public opinion. And if we continue to let this fester in election cycles the way it's being abused, I want to shift to, oh, you want to?
I have some comments about that. I think, again, I think this will be controversial, but I think that's fine. I think, one, we need to respect the patient and make them a part of the decision-making process. I really worry about hearing that people can't understand.
Yeah.
And I think if I would point to a central failure of the industry, the large companies, is the failure to invest productively in novel drug discovery technologies. If you look at them, it's all come from biotech that have far less resources. And the response to biotech has been to decentralize and externalize R&D, but in the end, when it comes to the final decision of what gets made into a drug, that's still centralized in the heads of R&D and the leadership of the major companies. I also question the model. I'm not sure, I don't believe that the FIP-GO model is any longer the right model for the industry. And yet every biotech company, except Ionis, and now they're doing it, immediately wants to build another sales force and another commercial organization. My God, we've got more than we need. We don't have the drugs to take advantage of that. And so I think, I actually question the whole thing. And what kind of a model could we experiment with that would help create the innovation that is lacking, that is the cause of the price increases. I'm also very troubled by what Emil Kakis, and I think he says it best, talks about. It's the tyranny of the p-value, actually the tyranny of statisticians. And I understand the genesis of it, but the clinical trials we do are the largest, most complex experiments ever tried. And we're inhibited from learning maximally from all these trials. And well, do I pick 1 or 2 or 3 endpoints? How much statistical penalty do I pay? I think that's nonsensical. And finally, I think the single-minded commitment of regulators to outcome studies is already having a terrible effect. I mean, how many major companies have exited cardiorenal indications because of the risk of outcome studies? I think there needs to be some intermediate solution that actually works a little better than demanding that you spend $1 billion on a single trial that could very easily fail despite the drug being successful, being a good drug. And so I think it's already happening. You see people disinvesting in still what are the largest categories of diseases. And I think there are solutions there that if reasonable people put their heads together, could protect the patient, could assure that we get outcome measures, but get the drug into the patients earlier and find ways to deflate the cost of some of the outcome trials. Novartis is doing an 8,000 patient outcome trial for our drug pelacarsen, which I'm very excited about. But there aren't many. We licensed that drug. There were lots of companies excited, and many of them just walked away because they were too afraid of the outcome trial costs. And how can that be good for patients? I don't see it.
I'd like to go back to something you said at the beginning of what you just said about, if I understood it correctly, you thought there was not very much innovation going on, and I'd like to challenge that.
No, I'm not. I didn't say that. No, there's incredible amounts of innovation.
Okay.
No. But is it enough? That's the question, and is there a way to make it better?
Yeah, well, I think it's been astounding, the amount of innovation
absolutely
we've had. And it brings me to, we've been talking about value, and there are a lot of different definitions of value. I think, look at the mRNA vaccines now. At approximately $20 a shot, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, protection against a potentially deadly disease, I think there's great value there. The companies involved made a lot of money, but they made a lot of money on something that I think was really a bargain for what you got. And so I think the value part, I know a number of people in the biopharma industry might worry about that kind of analysis. I actually think drugs will hold up very well.
I do too.
Their value proposition. In fact, it could, could backfire. It could be justification for going up when you look all in at what a drug might save in terms of doctor's visits, emergency room visits, hospitalizations, all of those things. So I think value is an important lens to look at things. People might be surprised at how it comes out. But I think the value should be applied not only to the drug, but to this supply chain. We've talked about how price is a composite of all of these contributors. What's the value that each participant in contributing to the cost, what value do they bring? Are they entitled to the share they're getting? And the same thing, I think, Alex, you mentioned transparency. I think transparency focused on one part, the pharma industry, is not going to address the situation fairly. So let's have transparency for how much is being, of the revenues are going to PBMs and to other middlemen and to the industry. So I like these lenses, but I think they need to be applied in a fair fashion.
And who's forcing the transparency is one of the questions I would have.
Yeah, so I agree with Mike, and I would even take it further. And this applies to the entire industry, not just pharma, but all of healthcare, which is fee-for-service reimbursement. If we really want to get to value, we have to find ways to move away from traditional fee-for-service reimbursement. Ultimately, it's what drives so much of what we don't like about America's health system, which I truly believe is the best health system in the world. The problem is it's not the best health system in the world for everyone at the right time because of so many of the challenges we have. in how it's organized, how it's paid for, the complexity, the layers. The only industry in America that still uses the fax machine, still uses the fax machine. And if that doesn't tell you just how crazy complex this is, I don't think anything else would. One of the things I'm enormously proud of, and this gets back to the ethos in Roy Vagelos' paper 30 years ago, in 2016, when I was at Aetna, we signed probably what was one of the first value-based contracts for Januvia and Genumet. And we said to Merck, and by the way, the company took it that seriously that Ken Fraser, as CEO, was directly involved in these conversations. Can we take our drugs and address a huge issue with the diabetic population? 50% of patients are not adherent to their meds 3 months after receiving their prescription. So what happens? They're hyperglycemic, they show up at the doctor's office, they show up in the emergency department. The doctor doesn't have a clue because they're not opening the medicine cabinet and they don't know. So what do? They double the dose of some type 2 drug, or they switch to a more expensive one. And what happens? The patient still comes back to the ED with a glucose of 350 and on and on and on. So we said, how about we create a value-based arrangement based on outcomes where if we could use Merck's adherence tools and we hired nurses to literally go in the home and open the medicine cabinets on a routine basis and make sure the patient stays on their meds, think of all these savings and downstream costs, but most importantly, think about the improvement in the quality of the life of the patient. And if we do it well and Merck does it well, they get more money. Now, that was one of the first probably in the country. 2016, we're seeing more of it. There are challenges though. Best price, there's this best pricing issue in commercial with Medicaid, as you know, where there are penalties obviously if through that value-based contract it doesn't work out the way everyone had hoped, then the reimbursement is much less. So that creates a big challenge. But we have to think of ways to move away, not just in pharma, but in paying physicians, in paying specialists, in paying hospitals. How do we move more and more towards value-based reimbursement? CMS, through CMS Innovations, is moving in this direction, but roughly, rough number, it may have gone up in the past year or so, it's about 11 or 12% of all reimbursement is true value-based. Commercial payers are getting more into this space, but by and large, most of what we do is still fee-for-service reimbursement. And that creates, I think, a lot of the challenges that we face across all of healthcare in America, and very unique and different than many other places in the world.
And what happens when we allow patients to understand where the costs are coming from? So this idea that we'll get to a value-based system, I talk to a lot of pharmaceutical executives who are very frustrated with the interpretation of value and how to get those contracts actually to operate. I mean, there's been, a lot of effort on part of the industry to make these work. And we're struggling to do that, and I think that struggle is noble and will be ongoing. But what can the industry do in the meantime? I would say that some of these programs that are supporting patients, that are calling them, that are giving them the information they need in a timely way and chronically in contact with the patients to support their decisions, their choices, and their care, those programs can be supported right now. The industry has the incentive to do that right now, and it's affordable to do because we see that when we do support patients, we have better outcomes and we keep patients adherent in ways that are profitable for the company and produce a better outcome for the patient. So on the way to figuring out the value-based equation, there are things that can also be done that I think taken up would solve maybe, or at least approach, two parts of the problem. One is the patient's perception that the company doesn't care about them and is just taking money or overcharging, and also being able to produce outcomes that will demonstrate value ultimately.
agree with everything that Hal said and you said. And again, it's a model that's focused where it ought to be focused, on the patient. And I don't think that the pharmaceutical and biotech industry should be the only part of that. I think all of the elements in delivering the drug to the patient should participate in an organized effort to improve outcome for the patient. I just think too much of the system is focused where it doesn't belong. And if we could direct everything to the best outcome for the patient, I think we'd solve a lot of problems. And I think the REMS model is at least a start, it seems to me.
Moving more of the dollars in the marketing budget from direct-to-consumer advertising to disease awareness campaigns is one step in that direction. At the same time, I want to be realistic. Think about all the marketing we did around vaccination, around mask wearing. It's not that simple either. And I think that's an understatement. I think that a big piece of this is predicated on trust. If, as a patient, you have a trusted relationship with a provider, it doesn't have to be a physician, it could be a nurse, it could be someone in the healthcare system in this country, the likelihood of that information having an impact on your ability to take better care of yourself is only amplified. And I think that there is no simple solution here, but it underscores what Mike said earlier about the role that the provider has to play in this entire equation if we're going to be successful. And again, for me, it's another reason why we have to move more and more to a value-based world, to bring everybody together to work in collaborative teams.
I would offer that the disinformation system and the energy and expense in creating disinformation was at greater volume and continues to be at greater volume. And the mechanisms of influencer strategy, trusted source, social media application to create engagement aren't as effectively used for good as they are for disinformation. And this, I think, is an opportunity and a challenge for the industry to become exquisitely contemporary around how influence is actually cultivated through trusted sources. And Stan, you said something earlier about the alignment between physicians and pharma. Mm-hmm. And would you think that that alignment is healthy now or broken now?
I think it's enormously complex. And I think maybe the better question is how to, whatever base we start from, I don't think we'll agree how broken it is or how fixed it is. But what is it that we can do that takes the patient and puts that patient in the center of this network designed to improve their life? And do physicians need detail men knocking on their door every day? Well, I know a lot of that's changed and so on. So I think if we can find a way to involve the patient in the value judgment in a more effective fashion, I think everybody's going to win. And I completely agree that the fee-for-service model is the wrong model. It doesn't work.
I was just going to add one point, and this is clearly a very complex conversation this morning to start out the day, but I think that pharma, and I'm the world's greatest optimist, has an enormous opportunity right now, and I'll tell you why. This year, 334,000 providers, the year that just ended, dropped out of the health caring profession. Mm-hmm. 334,000. It's unbelievable. That's physicians, nurse practitioners, physical therapists, a whole cadre of individuals that took early retirement, decided to do something else. This is the only industry, the healthcare industry, still today, that is almost entirely dependent on labor. look at every other sector of the economy, this is the only one that is dependent on people. I recently saw an analysis last week looking out into the future. What happens when, by the year 2060, the number of people that are 65 plus doubles? What happens when more and more individuals, as a result of extraordinary care from pharma and from the healthcare system, are alive with chronic illnesses? The demand and the burden on the healthcare system is huge, but the number of people that will be available in the next 10 years and 20 years to deliver that care will proportionally continue to go down. So as a nation, what do? This is not an industry that lends itself well to robots, in as much as there are opportunities for automation and AI and robotics, where other industries have basically just gone down that path in huge ways. It's much harder to do that here. And that's where I really see the promise in the pharmaceutical industry. All the things that we could use these discoveries to reduce the number of visits, to allow patients to be able to have good health without a surgery being done, without certain kinds of interventions. I mean, that's the enormous promise. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, that's where the focus should be, because the realities of workforce are not going away. The realities of an aging population and increased chronic disease are not going away. But the opportunity for discovery through biotech and pharma are huge. How can we now implement that? How can we create actionable steps that ultimately improve outcomes? That's the huge opportunity in front of the industry.
Alex, I've like your focus on the patient and educating the patient, and I've been a physician in practice most of my professional life, and try to be in tune to the needs of the patient. And some of the things that we are talking about in terms of helping patients navigate the system, I think are kind of a luxury compared to the situation they find themselves in. And that's why I am focused on out-of-pocket expense. So I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation. If you have a working person in the United States, income $60,000, so low wage, salaried worker who gets insurance through their employer, that person is probably taking home $40,000, $45,000 after taxes. They have a family of 4, so they're paying insurance of about $10,000. They have a deductible of between $2,000 and $4,000 for the first expenses in the year. Now, somebody in that family gets cancer, and they need a drug that costs $50,000, which, by the way, is not the most expensive cancer drug. And they have to pay 20% copay. So now they're paying $10,000. They wind up, by my calculations, of about $25,000 in their pocket. They don't have freedom to choose about anything. And they are really on the verge of bankruptcy, working person insured. If we cut the price, if we're the czar of healthcare, say we're going to cut the price of that drug by half, it doesn't make any difference to that person. They're still bankrupt at the end. So I think a system in which people are cost sharing to the extent they are in our insurance context is a huge problem. And back to the patient, when all of this kind of flow of funds gets sorted out, the only group not at the table is the patient. They're the only group not represented. Everybody's working around, maybe paying lip service, maybe not, but for sure, the copays have gone up, the deductibles have gone up. Sometimes the premiums have not, because more has been shifted to the patient out of pocket. So I really think unless we crack that nut, unless we address that problem squarely, we're really not going to get at the heart of this.
I think we would all agree that that is a hugely complex set of inputs that have to be challenged, and transparency around what's contributing to cost needs to be availed to the patients. And nobody understands. And you know, the answer, I talked to Ken Frazier about this last night, and he said the answer to the question is if you can't afford it, it's too expensive.
Exactly.
You know, and by the way, many people have insurance that would, you know, more than cover the cost. So they don't know how much it costs at all. They have no burden while other people go bankrupt.
In Europe, people don't pay for medicines, by and large. They don't pay, so you don't hear this kind of thing. And by the way, they don't have nearly the number of middlemen, and somehow they're able to get their drugs to their population.
But while we're in the situation we're in and the way the whole industry is arranged in healthcare, one of the things we can do as an industry is focus more on improving outcomes and supporting the patient more directly, and thinking about the drug effect as what we're delivering out of our R&D investment, but the total treatment effect is in our patient engagement investment. And that patient engagement investment, if it produces better patient experience, better patient outcomes, does that have an opportunity for us to justify the price of something and, you know, demonstrate value through a different set of perspectives, a more complete set of perspectives? Because right now, price alone is being used as a weapon against the industry. And I think we have a slide here that I would ask you to put up from a recent poll from the Galien webinar community, that we asked the question, with the recent passage of legislation authorizing the U.S. government involvement in lowering drug price, will it result in less innovation? And clearly, many people feel like the answer is yes. Mm-hmm. So while we're in this vice grip of being vilified, investment in innovation could be chilled, and the patient still won't get the benefit of affordability. So I guess, you know, what can we do short of making value-based care and value-based contracting a reality next year? What can the industry do on the behalf of the patients to keep our costs in check? We've talked about marketing and moving some of the marketing investment into patient services. Stan, you talked about R&D, you know, the cost of R&D. Are there opportunities to have more cost-effective clinical trials?
Well, you know, I mentioned, you know, the challenge of outcome trials, and the fact that we are disincented to learn maximally from our trials because of statistical penalties and that sort of thing. So I think that all is something we could work on. I don't mean to say it's easy. It's not going to be easy, but there are solutions to making clinical trials more efficient that are, I think, being inhibited by this devotion to the p-value, and of course you have to then make sure you don't do ad hoc and post hoc analyses that aren't justified. But so I think that can be done, and I continue to believe that the most important investments are in new, more efficient drug discovery technologies. I would go beyond it. We use a fax machine. I mean, the bulk of the investment is still small molecule drug discovery. That's vacuum tubes. I mean, it's making an iPad with a vacuum tube. And it's not anybody's fault. It's just that designing a small molecule to interact with a protein is really complex. And, you know, I like targeting RNA because I know the rules. It works. And I learn from the mistakes that I've made. Until the bulk of the industry is not change the method, change the drug, I think it's going to be so inefficient that almost everything else we do is lost in that inefficiency.
Alex, I really like outcomes because that's really the most important thing to patients. If you're going to recognize value by outcomes, then you probably can't use the system that we are using now. Very often in the life of a drug, you are demonstrating that you can impact a surrogate marker or some clinical sign that's not all the way to your biggest impact. So in such a system where you demonstrate outcome much later than the launch of the drug, I think the fair thing to do would be to have the price go up.
Exactly.
As you demonstrate. Not anything I understand, nobody wants to hear that. But if you're going to say the outcome is what's valuable, you have to give people time to demonstrate the outcome. Secondly, the outcome, if you put if that's the only lens, you potentially can impact innovation. You can put a chill on innovation. I'll bring up a controversial subject, the drugs for Alzheimer's disease from Biogen. There's been a lot of controversy and uproar from some quarters about the FDA approval of such a drug. In most fields, the first drug to come into an unmet medical area is far from the best drug. That was certainly the case for high blood pressure. When I was early in my career as a physician, the prescriptions I wrote for blood pressure lowering drugs, those aren't even on the market anymore. And they would be looked at today as terrible drugs. But they were the first. Right. And they worked. And the same thing, statins weren't the first cholesterol lowering drugs. And the earlier ones kind of would not be acceptable. So if you're so focused on outcomes that you say the first glimmer of hope in Alzheimer's isn't good enough, we shouldn't accept it. And by the way, that's what was said in general, not exclusively, for the first one. And now, well, surprise, actually, maybe the beta amyloid hypothesis might be right. And we're starting to see. So I just have a cautionary note that probably there isn't one lens that fits all. Outcomes really works, but you have to make some adjustment if you're going to use outcome as your parameter.
Actually, the anti-cancer experience is very telling, I think. The early anti-cancer drugs that were put out were just toxins. They were. And then there was a push from the FDA to go to outcomes, and drugs got better. And then after that, the analyses became much more sophisticated, and you get drugs approved in a variety of ways now. And I think also another big issue is the definition of diseases, which in my mind are archaic descriptions of what a patient looks like at the end of a molecular process that's been going on for 40 years. And yet, when you do a trial in diabetes, you have to take all comers and prove that you shifted the outcome for the whole patient population, when in fact at the molecular level you're dealing with probably 20 diseases or 100, I don't know. And once again, then because of concerns about sort of taking a small indication and inching it into a large sale, we're forced to continue that model, which makes zero sense. And there, again, there are real opportunities to help patients that are just being frittered away.
Maybe in the last minute, I'll mention last month I had an opportunity to moderate a panel with Peter Marks from the FDA, and we talked about Bayesian evidence-based approaches to approving new drugs. And to your point, and moving away from the very traditional randomized clinical controlled trials, to me, and just tying this whole conversation together, it seems like an enormous opportunity if we align that with value-based reimbursement. To your point,
Sure.
as we gather more data and information, there is a certain amount of reimbursement. As we learn more and more and we understand the value proposition of that breakthrough, the reimbursement correspondingly can go up. And I think along the way, other things will continue to happen to maybe take some of those layers out. Hopefully, I'm the world's greatest optimist, and we're not going to get, I don't think, for brand names and for biologicals to Mark Cuban's disruptive experiment that's growing. But I do think that it offers a promise, given where we are today and the opportunities we have, to create a much better alignment with discovery, innovation, value, and ultimately improving lives.
That's a beautiful summary. I don't think I could do a better job, so thank you for that. Thank you to the panel for this lively discussion and this difficult topic, and enjoy the rest of the Galien Forum.
Thank you.
Thank you.